Hello to all the wonderful listeners of Sci-fi Stories. I want to sincerely thank you for being here with us today. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, so we no longer have the budget to keep operating. If you find today's story entertaining, please consider supporting us with just $1, so we can pay our hardworking staff to cover their living expenses and continue creating more stories for you. You can support us by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the donation link in the description or the pinned comment below. They thought a human was nothing but primitive flesh, a cosmic joke thrust into an academy of telepathic gods. They thought melting off his hair would teach him his place at the bottom of the evolutionary ladder. They were wrong. He did not scream or beg. He simply calculated the exact surgical precision needed to take everything from them. The Deep Space Academy Tenebris hung like a metallic parasite on the edge of the galaxy, anchored to a massive dark energy mining station. The void of space here was absolute, a crushing blackness that made physical existence feel entirely insignificant. Inside the station, the atmosphere was thick with invisible currents. Tenebris was a gathering ground for the apex of evolution, a place exclusively for species possessing telepathic nodes and quantum neural connections. Their minds intertwined in a ceaseless psychic network, a silent symphony of thoughts and commands that echoed through the cold corridors. In this sea of advanced cognition walked Braxton Benjamin. He was the sole human cadet, an anomaly tolerated only for a bureaucratic quota. To the other species, Braxton was fundamentally broken. They called him the biological blind man because the human brain possessed no telepathic gland, no organ capable of tapping into the mental link of the station. He was trapped inside his own skull, deaf to the psychic frequencies that governed the facility. The undisputed leader of the elite cadets was Valor, a being of the Xylari species. Valor was a specimen of biological supremacy. Rising from his spine were 4 translucent neural limbs. These appendages crackled with latent energy, allowing him to manipulate physical objects and override complex machinery using nothing but his thoughts. He moved through the academy like a god, his will enforcing itself upon the environment. Because Braxton could not interface mentally with the automated maintenance drones, he was subjected to the most grueling and hazardous physical labor. They sent him out into the freezing vacuum of space for manual external repairs. He repaired solar arrays and thermal vents by hand, suspended over the infinite abyss, with only a thin tether holding him back from oblivion. Yet, he never complained. He executed every perilous assignment with a stoic silence and a terrifying physical endurance that defied the hostile environment. This unyielding resilience became a thorn in the mind of Valor. The Xylari could not understand how a primitive creature could endure so much without breaking. It offended him. Valor began to actively target Braxton. He mocked the human physical form, particularly focusing on his hair. Valor referred to it as dead biological fibers, a pathetic remnant of a lesser evolutionary stage. The elite cadets, with their crystalline skulls and pulsing sensory tentacles, laughed in synchronized telepathic amusement at the creature who grew dead tissue from his scalp. Braxton ignored the barrage of insults. The psychic taunts could not breach his mind, and the verbal ones did not matter. He hoarded the few hours of rest he was given, retreating to the isolation of his quarters. There, away from the prying eyes of the telepaths. He did not sleep. He meticulously studied the highly classified structural blueprints of the Tenebris Dark Energy Reactor Core. It was a dense labyrinth of quantum mechanics and thermal dynamics, a seemingly harmless academic pursuit. No one knew that this silent, blind human was mapping the exact architecture of their impending doom. The ambient hum of the station ventilation masked the silent intrusion. During the deep sleep cycle of the third planetary rotation, the heavy metallic door to the human quarters slid open without a single mechanical click. Valor and his inner circle did not need override codes. They simply wove their minds into the quantum security matrix, manipulating the lock mechanisms through pure telepathic will. They floated into the room, their forms casting long, distorted shadows across the sterile floor. Their intent was clear. They were going to educate the primitive creature on the harsh realities of evolutionary hierarchy. Braxton lay paralyzed inside his cryogenic sleep pod, his vital signs suppressed to a mere fraction of their waking state to conserve station resources. He was completely defenseless. One of the alien cadets stepped forward, holding a containment vial stolen from the medical wing. Inside sloshed a highly concentrated organic solvent, a medical-grade soft tissue dissolving acid typically used for necrotic flesh removal. With a casual flick of a neural limb, the pod seal was breached. They poured the corrosive liquid directly over the human head. The chemical reaction was instantaneous, but entirely silent in the vacuum of the pod. The acid ate through the keratin fibers, melting his hair down to the very root follicles, hidden deep within the folds of his scalp. They left him there, the corrosive agent searing his flesh, leaving behind a completely bald, blistered, and chemically burned skull. When the artificial morning cycle initiated, Braxton awoke. The sleep fluid drained away, exposing his raw nerves to the cold air of the room. The pain was absolute, a searing agony that would have sent any other cadet screaming down the corridors toward the medical bay. Braxton did not scream. He did not hit the emergency communications. He rose from the pod with slow, mechanical deliberation. He walked to the small metallic mirror above the hygiene station. The reflection, staring back, was horrific. His head was stripped bare, the skin an angry, inflamed crimson. Deep chemical burns etched across his scalp, slowly, weeping thin trails of blood that ran down his neck. He stared at his own ruined flesh. His eyes were devoid of panic, devoid of anger. They were utterly lifeless, reflecting the cold precision of a machine assessing structural damage. The silence in the room was heavier than the gravity plating, moving with the slow, deliberate pace of a ticking clock. Braxton turned away from the mirror. He did not seek bandages. Instead, he retrieved a high-fidelity technical scanner from his tool belt, a device meant for detecting microfractures in starship hulls. He adjusted the sensory parameters to scan organic matter. With steady hands, he ran the emitter over his bleeding scalp, wincing only slightly as the laser touched the exposed nerves. The small screen illuminated with chemical data. He carefully measured the residual acid concentration and broke down its molecular structure. The signature was unmistakable. It contained unique enzymatic compounds synthesized exclusively within the biological chambers of the Xylari species. There was no outburst of rage. There was no swearing of revenge. Braxton walked over to his personal terminal. His fingers, smeared with his own blood, flew across the physical keyboard. He bypassed the Academy Public Archives and sliced directly into the restricted medical database. He downloaded vast amounts of classified data, detailing the complete biological, nervous, and quantum anatomical structure of the Xylari race. He studied the complex web of their neural limbs, the exact voltage of their spinal nodes, the precise density of their nerve clusters. The glow of the terminal illuminated his scarred face. His eyes tracked the alien anatomy with surgical focus. In the absolute quiet of the room, he finally spoke. His voice was barely a breath, cold and devoid of any human warmth. Every complex system has a breaking point. 2 hours later, the Academy cafeteria was a cacophony of telepathic chatter and the clinking of feeding utensils. Hundreds of elite alien cadets gathered for their nutrient rations. The heavy doors slid open. Braxton stepped inside. The mental chatter died instantly. Hundreds of eyes and sensory organs turned toward the human. His head was a raw, weeping wound, a canvas of red ulcers and exposed tissue beneath the harsh overhead lights. For a moment, there was nothing but stunned silence. Then, the laughter began. It started as a low psychic ripple and erupted into physical, mocking roars that shook the cafeteria tables. They pointed their appendages, relishing in the visible humiliation of the lower species. Valor detached himself from his elite table and glided across the floor, his four neural limbs twitching in amusement. He stopped right in front of Braxton, towering over the bleeding human. With a condescending gesture, Valor reached out and patted Braxton heavily on the shoulder. "Look at this. We did you a favor, human. We merely liberated your primitive brain from all those dead fibers. You look much more evolved now." Braxton did not flinch from the touch. He did not look away. He slowly tilted his ruined head upward, locking his dead eyes onto the glowing crystalline face of the Xylari leader. The edges of his lips twitched upward into a smile. It was a slight, subtle expression, yet it carried an underlying promise of such profound violence that the physical temperature in the room seemed to plummet. He said nothing, simply allowing that chilling smile to linger. 3 days later, the main training deck transformed into a vast, spherical zero-gravity combat arena. The artificial gravity plating had been entirely deactivated to simulate deep void engagements. Hundreds of cadets floated in the observation tiers, their psychic chatter creating a localized hum of anticipation. This was the weekly live combat drill, a brutal showcase of hierarchical dominance. Normally, the human cadet would huddle in the maintenance corridors, avoiding the spectacle. Today was different. Without a word, Braxton propelled himself off a steel bulkhead and drifted straight into the center of the sphere. He reached out and tapped the primary console, bathing himself in a harsh, crimson glow. It was the challenge light. He locked his dead, unblinking eyes onto the viewing gallery and pointed a single, scarred finger directly at Valor. A human challenging a Xylari elite was unprecedented. It was statistical suicide. Valor descended from the upper tiers with predatory grace, his four neural limbs unfurling like the wings of a glowing, mechanical beast. The appendages pulsed with crackling violet energy, destabilizing the air molecules around him. He intended to crush this fragile, bald creature into a bloody pulp for the sheer entertainment of the Academy. He floated into the crimson ring, his crystalline face contorted into a mask of pure arrogance. "You have finally decided to beg for death, primitive," Valor sneered, his voice projecting both physically and telepathically across the massive chamber. Braxton said nothing. When the proximity alarms blared to signal the start of the match, he did not reach for a standard-issue stun rifle. He did not activate a kinetic energy shield. Instead, he unclipped a small, heavy cylinder from his utility belt. It was a micro-point cutter, a high-temperature industrial tool designed for precision welding on heavy starship armor. Over the past 72 hours, Braxton had meticulously recalibrated its frequency to match a very specific quantum wavelength. Valor lunged. He used his neural limbs to launch himself forward like a living missile, tearing through the zero-gravity environment with terrifying speed. Braxton did not attack. He simply rotated his body on a micro-axis, letting the first glowing appendage miss his shoulder by a fraction of a millimeter. The Xylari leader unleashed a furious barrage of strikes, each one carrying enough kinetic force to shatter a titanium bulkhead. Braxton evaded them with a passive, maddening fluidity. He was not fighting. He was executing a complex mathematical equation in real time, calculating spatial geometry and kinetic vectors. He allowed himself to be pushed back, step by step, drift by drift, until he was corralled into the lower quadrant of the arena, a known gravity blind spot where the stabilization thrusters were weakest. The observation tiers erupted into a cacophony of psychic laughter and jeers. The audience watched eagerly, fully believing the human was out of maneuvers and about to be torn apart. Valor raised all four of his appendages, merging their energies into a single, devastating kinetic hammer designed to crush the human against the hull. Then, the equation solved itself. As Valor drove the massive strike downward, Braxton did not dodge away. He leaned directly into the attack, using the sheer propulsive force generated by the Xylari's own momentum. Braxton hooked his boot onto a tiny, protruding environmental sensor on the wall. He used it as an anchor to abruptly alter his trajectory, sliding frictionlessly right beneath the sweeping arc of Valor's psychic shield. He was now inside the Xylari guard, hovering mere inches from the alien exposed back. All the anatomical data, every nerve cluster, every voltage measurement he had burned into his memory from the medical database, aligned perfectly with the physical target. Braxton moved with surgical, mechanical ruthlessness. He bypassed the armored plates of the alien spine and pressed the modified micropoint cutter precisely against the 4 quantum nodes, the vital biological sockets connecting the neural limbs to Valor's central nervous system. In exactly 1.2 seconds, Braxton pulled the trigger. He did not unleash a blast of heat. Instead, the cutter emitted a violently conflicting electrical pulse, a frequency designed to perfectly cancel out the quantum resonance of Xylari tissue. The beam severed the limbs at a microscopic, cellular level. It cauterized the nerve endings faster than the pain signals could travel. The 4 magnificent, glowing neural limbs instantly went dark. They detached from Valor's spine completely and floated away in the zero-gravity chamber, like dead, withered branches detaching from a rotting tree. Because of the absolute precision of the subatomic cut, there was not a single drop of blood spilled into the air. The deafening noise of the arena vanished. The laughter died in hundreds of throats. A suffocating, absolute silence slammed into the observation tiers. It took Valor's brain 3 full seconds to process the total severing of his nervous system. When the realization of his permanent mutilation finally crashed into his consciousness, he opened his mouth. A scream of pure, unadulterated agony ripped through his vocal cords. A sound so raw and devastating it forced several cadets in the audience to cover their auditory receptors. Valor thrashed helplessly in the zero gravity, a crippled, flailing mass of pain. Braxton Benjamin did not smile. He did not gloat. He calmly switched off the micropoint cutter, clipped it back onto his utility belt, and used a gentle push off the wall to float slowly toward the exit, leaving the ruined god screaming in his wake. The sterile white lights of the medical wing were stained with the frantic energy of panic. Xylari surgeons, beings usually considered the absolute masters of biological manipulation, stood paralyzed around the hovering surgical table. On it lay Valor, strapped down by heavy energy bands, his muscular frame convulsing in violent phantom pain. The medical personnel deployed microscopic sensory tendrils to examine the severed stumps at the base of his spine. The horror they discovered was not in the amount of blood, for there was absolutely none, but in the terrifying perfection of the wound. The modified tool had not merely sliced through organic tissue. It had completely scrambled the quantum signature of the nerve endings at the subatomic level. The cellular bridges required for Xylari neural regeneration were permanently fused shut. The reigning god of the Academy, the apex specimen of their generation, was reduced to a crippled mortal. He would never wield a neural limb again. Less than 24 hours later, the Academy High Council summoned the human. The Grand Judicial Chamber, a vast amphitheater of floating obsidian platforms, was heavy with the psychic weight of 12 furious alien elders. They demanded his immediate execution for the unprovoked, malicious mutilation of a superior species. Braxton stood perfectly still in the center of the room, his scarred, hairless head reflecting the cold, overhead illumination. He did not shout in anger. He did not offer a passionate plea for mercy or justice. Instead, he calmly uploaded a massive data file to the central holographic console. It was a 300-page legal and structural analysis. He spoke with the chilling detachment of an automated defense system. According to subsection 4, Paragraph 12 of the Academy Threat Neutralization Protocol. A cadet facing a lethal kinetic strike in a sanctioned combat environment is authorized to apply the exact counterforce necessary to neutralize the aggressor weapons. Braxton paused, letting the heavy silence stretch across the chamber. I applied zero redundant force. I surgically neutralized the weapons. No additional physical harm was inflicted upon the target. The Elder's Cross referenced his biometric data, the slow-motion arena footage, and the rigid Academy bylaws. The logic was an airtight, suffocating trap. The primitive human had outmaneuvered the most advanced, hyper-intelligent minds in the sector, using their own bureaucratic architecture against them. He was acquitted of all charges. The atmosphere within Tenebris shifted radically overnight. The open mockery evaporated entirely, replaced by a suffocating, paranoid dread. The human was no longer the Academy punching bag. The telepaths, entirely accustomed to reading the emotions and intentions of everyone around them, found themselves staring into a terrifying void when they looked at Braxton. Before the incident, his mental silence was merely a sign of his biological inferiority. Now, that exact same silence felt like a gaping abyss waiting to drag them down into the dark. Every time he entered a corridor, the psychic chatter died instantly. Elite cadets would press themselves against the cold metal bulkheads just to avoid coming within a foot of him. The apex predators had suddenly realized they were sharing a cage with a monster they could not comprehend. Braxton welcomed the absolute isolation. It provided him with the perfect cover. While the entire station reeled from the psychological shockwave of his actions, he quietly slipped into the biological disposal wing. The discarded neural limbs of Valor had been marked for high-temperature incineration. Braxton intercepted the automated disposal drone. He carefully packed the 4 withered, crystalline appendages into a secure containment case and carried them back to his private laboratory. He laid them out on his sterile workbench, meticulously dissecting the dead tissue to extract the highly volatile quantum nodes he had studied so intensely. It was a morbid, solitary harvest, a dark preparation for an equation only he knew was coming. It started as a microscopic fluctuation. During the 14th hour of the station night cycle, the primary security grid flickered. A localized warning light flashed a pale amber on the maintenance consoles near the dark energy reactor core, signaling a severe subatomic pressure variance. The elite alien cadets on duty, arrogant in their absolute reliance on telepathic early warning systems, dismissed the mechanical alert. They assumed it was a standard hardware glitch, a minor hiccup in the thermal regulators. Because there was no psychic distress signal echoing through their minds, they believed there was no danger. But Braxton was not tethered to their false sense of security. His eyes, trained to read the hard, unforgiving data of the physical universe, locked onto the diagnostic screens in his isolated room. The variance was not a glitch. The pressure was building rapidly. His understanding of the reactor blueprints told him exactly what was happening. It was a spatial fracture. The survival instincts embedded deep within his primitive, mammalian DNA began to scream. A red alert sounded in the silent fortress of his mind. Deep within the lowest engineering decks, the immense pressure of the dark energy reactor finally shattered the primary containment shell. It did not explode with fire or radiation. It tore the very fabric of reality. A jagged, bleeding wound in 3-dimensional space ripped open, plunging the entire lower sector into absolute zero temperatures. From the abyssal darkness of that dimensional fracture, the Void Weavers poured into the station. They were nightmare constructs of shifting shadows and razored geometry, parasitic entities existing slightly out of phase with standard matter. They possessed no eyes, no ears, and no physical mouths. Instead, they relied on a highly specialized predatory sensory organ designed to detect a single, specific thing within the dark universe, the vibrant, pulsing frequencies of telepathic activity. To avoid Weaver, The tenebrous academy was a blinding, irresistible beacon of food. The creatures cascaded through the ventilation shafts and maintenance corridors like a swarm of starving locusts. The advanced kinetic barriers of the station, designed to withstand a direct meteor strike, were utterly useless. The entities slipped through the energy shields like smoke passing through a net. The slaughter was instantaneous, brutal, and completely silent. In the upper promenades, dozens of elite alien cadets attempted to form a unified psychic shield to repel the invaders. It was the absolute worst mistake they could make. The moment they ignited their quantum neural connections, the Void Weavers latched onto their massive mental signatures. The shadow entities bypassed physical armor entirely, plunging their dark, ethereal appendages directly into the crystalline skulls of the cadets. The alien brains, instantly overloaded by the sudden, violent draining of their life force, literally boiled inside their heads. Acrid smoke hissed from their sensory tentacles as they dropped to the floor in synchronized heaps of burning flesh. When the remaining survivors tried to broadcast telepathic distress signals, they only painted brighter targets on their own backs. The very evolution that made them gods now rendered them helpless prey. Emergency blast doors slammed shut across the facility, initiating a total station lockdown in a futile attempt to halt the infestation. Inside the central medical ward, the bright, sterile lights flickered and died, replaced by the sickly crimson glow of emergency backup power. Valor lay heavily strapped to his recovery bed, his crippled body numb from massive doses of painkillers. He watched the heavy, reinforced doors of the ward warp and buckle inward. The deafening screech of tearing metal echoed through the room as a swarm of Void Weavers tore through the barricade. They slithered across the ceiling, descending upon the panicked medical staff. Valor had no neural limbs to channel defensive energy. He had no physical strength left to run, stripped of his supremacy. The fallen leader simply closed his eyes and waited for the shadow to consume his mind. Then, a heavy boot stepped over the shattered remains of the medical doors. Valor snapped his eyes open, expecting the cold touch of death. Instead, he saw the human. Braxton Benjamin walked straight through the center of the room, entirely surrounded by dozens of the swirling, nightmarish entities. The Void Weavers brushed right past his shoulders, their shadowy tendrils weaving through the air just inches from his scarred face. They ignored him completely. It was a terrifying, mind-bending revelation. Because the human possessed no telepathic gland, because his primitive brain emitted absolutely zero quantum resonance, he was perfectly invisible to the apex predators, to the hunting senses of the Void Weavers. Braxton was nothing more than a piece of inert machinery, a silent stone standing untouched in a roaring river of psychic noise. Braxton did not waste a single second looking at the gruesome slaughter around him. He marched directly to the recovery bed, unclipped a heavy surgical bone saw from a nearby tray, and smashed the magnetic restraints holding Valor down. He grabbed the crippled Xylari leader by the heavy collar of his medical gown and viciously dragged him off the mattress. Valor hit the metal floor hard, groaning in agony as his unhealed wounds flared up. His mind reeled from the impossible sight of the bald human standing safe amidst the cosmic horrors. "Why?" Valor gasped, his voice trembling as he looked up at the cold, emotionless face of his former victim. "Why are you pulling me out of here? You should leave me to die." Braxton hauled Valor upward, throwing the heavy alien arm over his own shoulder and adjusting his grip to support the dead weight. His voice was flat, devoid of any anger or compassion, sounding only like a machine delivering a calculated output. "You dying now would ruin the variable in my equation. Keep your mouth shut and do not attempt to use any telepathic waves, or I will drop you right here." They stumbled out of the ruined medical ward, entering the dark, blood-stained corridors. Braxton dragged the alien leader through the shifting shadows, moving with deliberate, measured steps to avoid the roaming swarms. His analytical mind raced through the complex reactor blueprints he had memorized during his isolation. Standard security protocols and kinetic weapons were mathematically proven to be useless against an enemy that existed between dimensions. There was only one viable method to stop the total consumption of the station. They had to travel down to the lowest deck, breach the reactor control room, and trigger a catastrophic reverse detonation of the core. The immense gravitational singularity created by the implosion would act as a cosmic vacuum, sucking the Void Weavers back through the spatial tear and forcefully welding the dimension shut before the entire station exploded. But as Braxton dragged the groaning alien toward the heavy access elevator, the fatal flaw in his calculation surfaced. He knew the structural layout perfectly, and he knew the exact sequence required to overload the cooling rods. However, the final command console for the dark energy core was not operated by physical levers or mechanical keystrokes. It was a maximum security terminal, locked by a strict quantum neural passcode. It specifically required a living, highly advanced telepathic connection to authorize a core overload. A biologically blind human, no matter how intelligent or ruthless, could never turn the key. The descent into the engineering bowels of the station was a journey through a slaughterhouse. Braxton hauled the dead weight of the Xylari leader down the darkened stairwells, his heavy boots slipping on pools of alien bioluminescent blood. The air was freezing, thick with the metallic scent of torn bulkheads and the unnatural ozone stench of the shadow entities. As they reached the final heavy blast door leading to the reactor corridor, Braxton froze. A swarm of Void Weavers was patrolling the passage, their ethereal tendrils sweeping the area for any trace of biological or quantum signatures. Braxton knew his human lack of telepathy made him invisible. But Valor, even crippled and dying, still radiated a faint, residual quantum hum. They were going to be detected. Braxton lowered Valor to the floor. He needed a chemical camouflage, something to blind the localized sensory organs of the hunters. He reached up to his own ruined scalp. With brutal, mechanical efficiency, he dug his fingers into the healing chemical burns, deliberately tearing open the raw flesh. The synthetic Xylari solvent that had melted his hair was still deeply bonded to his cellular structure. He let the mixture of human blood and alien corrosive acid pool in his palm, then smeared the thick crimson paste across Valor's face and chest. The sharp, synthetic chemical signature entirely masked the faint quantum resonance of the fallen alien. Braxton hoisted him back up and walked directly through the swarm. The shadow creatures recoiled slightly from the harsh chemical scent, allowing the two survivors to slip through the nightmare untouched. They breached the main reactor control room, slamming the manual override lock on the heavy reinforced door behind them. The chamber bathed them in the angry, pulsating amber light of the destabilizing dark energy core. Through the massive observation window, the spatial tear hung in the center of the containment chamber like a jagged wound in the universe, bleeding pure darkness into the station. Braxton dropped Valor near the primary console. The alien leader looked up at the monolithic, featureless obsidian slab that controlled the reactor. There were no physical inputs. There were no biological scanners. It was a pure quantum neural interface. "It is over," Valor coughed, holding his bleeding side. "You brought us all the way down here for nothing. The core lock requires a Class 9 telepathic authorization to initiate a reverse sequence. You do not even have a single neural receptor. We are going to burn." Braxton did not reply. He unzipped his heavy utility pack and pulled out a crude, heavy mechanical gauntlet. It was a masterpiece of desperate, horrifying engineering. Woven into the metallic mesh were the 4 crystalline quantum nodes he had surgically harvested from Valor's severed limbs. Thick, insulated cables ran from the gauntlet, ending in sharp, sterilized microneedles. Valor watched in absolute, paralyzing horror as he realized what the human had built in the dark isolation of his quarters. "You are insane," Valor whispered. "A primitive human brain cannot process raw quantum waves. The data stream will completely liquefy your frontal lobe in a microsecond. It is biological suicide." "I only need 15 seconds," Braxton stated coldly. He slid the heavy gauntlet onto his right arm. Then, without a single moment of hesitation, he slammed the microneedles directly into the raw, weeping nerve clusters on his chemically burned scalp. The connection bypassed his skull completely, hardwiring the stolen xylary quantum nodes straight into his human nervous system. The agony was absolute. It was not a physical pain. It was the sensation of a dying star being forced into a fragile glass jar. The raw, unfiltered quantum energy of the universe slammed into Braxton's primitive brain, overloading every single synapse simultaneously. Blood immediately began to pour from his nose and ears. His vision fractured into a million blinding shards of light. The sheer telepathic weight threatened to instantly obliterate his consciousness. But this was the one singular domain where humanity reigned supreme. The aliens possessed magic, but humans possessed endurance. They were creatures born of gravity, forged in struggle, and defined by their capacity to absorb suffering without breaking. Braxton roared, a guttural, primal scream that echoed over the deafening whine of the failing reactor. He slammed his armored node-infused hand onto the obsidian console. The interface flared brilliant violet, recognizing the stolen xylary signature. His brain was actively cooking inside his skull, but he held his mind together through pure, unimaginable willpower. 1 second, 5 seconds, 10 seconds. He mentally forced the authorization codes through the burning pathways of his mind, locking the containment protocols and reversing the gravitational polarity of the dark energy core. At exactly 15 seconds, he finalized the command and ripped the needles from his scalp, collapsing to the floor in a pool of his own blood. The reactor core detonated inwards. A massive, reverse gravitational singularity erupted within the chamber. It acted as an infinitely powerful cosmic vacuum. Across the entire station, every single Void Weaver was violently ripped from their prey and dragged through the bulkheads, sucked back into the spatial tear. With a final, blinding flash of pure kinetic energy, the singularity collapsed upon itself, permanently welding the dimensional fracture shut. The catastrophic threat was neutralized. 1 month later, the Tenebrous Academy was fully operational again. The structural damage had been repaired, but the psychological landscape of the station was forever altered. In the main observation deck, Braxton stood looking out into the endless, starry void. His hair had begun to grow back in thick, short patches, partially covering the jagged, terrifying scars that crisscrossed his scalp. Valor approached him. The once magnificent alien no longer possessed his glowing neural limbs. In their place were 4 heavy, rudimentary mechanical prosthetics, a permanent, physical reminder of his defeat. Valor stopped a respectful distance away. There were no dramatic speeches. There were no tearful apologies or declarations of friendship. Such things had no place in the cold reality of the void. Instead, Valor lowered his crystalline head and dropped to one knee, executing the highest, most sacred ritual of absolute respect known to the Xylari race. Braxton slowly turned his head. He looked down at the crippled god kneeling before him and simply offered a single, silent nod. The audience of the galaxy, the watching eyes of 100 advanced species, finally understood the terrifying truth. You must never take anything from a human. If you strip them of their dignity, they will forge that humiliation into an armor of absolute resolve. If you steal their weapons, they will rip off your limbs and build new ones to slaughter your nightmares. From that day forward, the elite species of the universe no longer looked at humanity with disgust. They looked at them with a profound, suffocating reverence. Thank you so much to all of our amazing listeners for staying with us until the very end of this incredible journey. Where are you listening to this story from right now? Please let us know in the comments below. If you found today's story entertaining and want to help us keep this channel alive, please consider supporting us with just $1. You can easily do this by scanning the QR code currently on your screen, or by using the donation link provided in the description and the pinned comment. Your generous support goes directly to paying our dedicated staff, helping them feed their families, and allowing us to continue creating even better stories for you in the future.